Welcome to the holidays here at All Day. It's my hope that you would think of this as a place that you can really call home. And it's also my sincere hope that there is something for everyone, regardless of what or how you celebrate. And so this series, December Lights, that we're starting today is really about deriving wisdom and inspiration from various traditions that take place, that are celebrated at this time of year, and perhaps even lesser known aspects or lesser known stories of the traditions that we are more familiar with. But that title, December Lights, is really about the fact that this month is a special month where many religions, many spiritual traditions have a sacred day or sacred set of days. And a lot of these traditions revolve around the symbol of light and of lights, right? That a light shining in darkness is a recurring theme throughout this month, throughout the holiday season. And so the question I want to ask is, what are these different December lights, and what type of possibility do they have for our lives, regardless of whether or not we celebrate these particular traditions? And so today, the December lights that we're going to be talking about specifically are quite literally candles. Because if you've been around here at Aldea long enough, you've probably noticed that candles are a very big part of what we do, right? We do candle lighting mostly every single service. And this is the first place that I've ever worked that has candles as part of our budget, but it just needs to be that way because we go through a lot of candles. You can pledge fully in candles. I forgot to mention that. You could say, I'm going to pledge 1,000 candles for 2025. But if you do, they have to be a very specific. No, I'm just kidding. Just don't do that. It's too complicated. But the idea of lighting a candle, and what I love about what happens here is that every time we go up to light a candle, it can mean something different for you. It can represent your own personal connection, and that symbol can have its own significant meaning for you. But behind me, I have two very significant candle holders, a menorah and a kinara, and both of these hold candles that have very significant meanings for the traditions that they come from. And so I want to spend today talking about those meanings and to ask ourselves how we might be inspired by them. And I'll start by saying that if I'm going to talk about Hanukkah today, I do want to let you know I am part Jewish. People are always shocked when they hear that for some reason. But I want to kind of be very clear about how Jewish I am, and to be very honest about how Jewish I am. I've been to the temple twice in my life. Both times were because of a funeral. And when I went to the temple, it's customary for a male going to temple to wear a yarmulke, which is the hat that is worn on the back of the head. Of course, I don't have my own because that's how Jewish I am. And so each time I've gone to the temple, I had to, go through like this box where they have spare yarmulkes for people like me. And so I'll pick one, and I'm pretty sure it had like in Sharpie, like property of Mount Sinai Temple written on it. And I wear it, so I put on my spare yarmulke and I walk into the temple, and then I see a lot of the real Jews with their legitimate embroidered, personalized yarmulke, LA Dodgers yarmulke, Lakers yarmulke. And they gave me this look to say that I'm not legit, but it's okay. I understand. That's about how Jewish I am. But the reality is I have celebrated Hanukkah before, which, if you're not familiar, takes place over 8 nights. And, if you're used to celebrating Christmas, especially as a kid, and in terms of gift giving and receiving, it can be a little climactic to receive your gifts spread out over 8 nights. Okay, if I'm being honest, I didn't even do Hanukkah that way because I spent it with my grandparents and I saw them over a weekend, so we condensed it all into one night. Nonetheless, you get the idea. I have some connection to Hanukkah, but what I love about Hanukkah, and especially appreciating it as I've gotten older over time, is the reality that Hanukkah plays with time a little bit differently than some holidays, right? It takes place over 8 nights, and there's something interesting when we approach spirituality from the lens of time and approaching time differently. And there's a great author and rabbi named Abraham Heschel who writes about the spirituality of Judaism and how it specifically pertains to time. He says, Judaism is a religion of time aiming at the sanctification of time. Time is the heart of existence. Now, you can replace Judaism for pretty much anything because I think in a greater sense, in a broader sense, spirituality, whatever that may look like for you, is about our relationship with time. It's about sanctification of time because, yes, time is in many ways the heart of existence. And so, friends, when we think about the holidays, perhaps we're not just thinking about spaces that we create in our lives, but also time that we're dedicating. See, for how many of us, when we think about our most cherished memories of the holidays, perhaps growing up or even more recently, something that comes up is that quality time, is that time where perhaps you and your loved ones are not working. You have time deliberately set aside for connection. And the idea of creating time in a sacred sense is in so many ways how a lot of us receive love, that for many of us, our love language is some form of quality time, right? And so we can give and receive love by setting aside time in a sacred manner. And I think this is what the rabbi is talking about in some sense. But this idea of time being a sacred thing, particularly in the context of spirituality, and particularly in the context of the Jewish religion, also shows up in something like the Sabbath, which is another central part of Jewish spirituality. See, if we look at the origins of the Hebrew people and how this story tracks throughout the Old Testament, in many ways, this narrative begins in Exodus with Moses and with the Israelite people in captivity in Egypt. And this enslaved people, as many of us know, through the story, becomes free, right? Escapes captivity in Egypt, escapes slavery. And though they find their way to physical freedom, political freedom, there is some sense in which they are not mentally and spiritually free because they have spent centuries in slavery, centuries in captivity, centuries with their only identity as the work that they do, what they produce. And so the Sabbath is instituted because you have a people who are free physically but not free in their minds. And the Sabbath is a way of saying, hey, let's dedicate one day each week to rest, to putting off that identity of what you produce and just to be. And how many of us can see this dynamic show up in our own lives, right? That you could be off work but not actually turn it off. Maybe this is true for some of you who retired, right? You spent your whole career really deeply invested in the work that you did. And then the day that you retired, you weren't necessarily able to just turn it all off. In many ways, spirituality is about mending our relationship with time. And so when you think about your holidays, the way that you've spent the holidays throughout your life, right? It's not just about a sanctified location, but it's about a sanctified time. And the sacred traditions that you have, right, whether they be the movies that you watch, the foods that you eat, the games that you play, they're all dependent on a time being set aside. And yet when it comes to these sacred traditions, the story of Hanukkah in many ways starts with the loss of sacred traditions. See, as I just mentioned, the Old Testament history of the Jewish people in many ways starts with their captivity in Egypt, but this is a common theme and a cyclical event in the history of the Hebrew people, continually being conquered by larger, more powerful kingdoms and having their beliefs and their practices taken away from them. And so we pick up the story in 2nd century BC, when the Hebrew people have been overtaken by the Greeks, and the Greeks have outlawed the Jewish religion. And they've not only done that, but they have defiled their temple, their sacred space, right? Sacrificing pigs on their altar, creating gods from the Greek pantheon and putting them up in the temple. And so what happens is there is a rebellion that takes place, led by a family that became known as the Maccabees, although this is a synonym for the rebellion at large. And this rebellion is ultimately a small force facing overwhelming odds, fighting for the sacredness of their beliefs and their religion. So much devotion to the sanctity of their own spiritual practices, that they are honoring the Sabbath during these battles in that they refuse to fight on a Sabbath day. Sometimes this means losing battles. Sometimes this means giving up their lives in order to simply refuse to fight on a sacred day. And yet, despite all this, despite these overwhelming odds, they still win their freedom and they return to the temple, right, to get everything back in order. And they find, as they go to light the candles in the temple, that there is only one jar left that has been undisturbed, one jar of oil left. And normally that would account for just one day of the flames burning in the temple. But this one jar of oil lasts for 8 days. This, friends, is the miracle of Hanukkah. And now, for those of you who have spent time at Aldea, you understand that we like looking at these stories from a perspective of symbol and myth. And so for me, whether or not this miracle actually literally happened is pretty irrelevant. I'm much more interested in the power of this story and how we might look at it and how it might even apply to our lives today. And what I see when I look at this story is that this moment of freedom and this moment of returning to their values is not met with a mighty and extravagant and instantaneous miracle, right? Clouds parting or thunder coming from the skies, but really an intimate miracle of the persistence of light. And of course, it can be really tricky to talk about war, particularly in the context of the Jewish people now more than ever. And this in no way is any kind of affirmation of war or violence, but this is really about thinking of how this story might, taken as metaphor, be applied to our own journeys, because we all face overwhelming odds. We all face mountains in our lives. We all look at the world sometimes and feel like there is so much to overcome all around us. And it can be so important to remember that the miracle that we're looking for is not always going to be big and extravagant and instantaneous, but it might be an intimate reminder, a reminder to hold to our values and our spiritual practices. And so there are 8 lights on the menorah that represent time, and they represent the endurance of light. And when we think about this endurance, it calls to mind this word resilience that we've been using, right, over the past couple of months. And just think about for your life, when were those moments where the miracle in your life was simply having the endurance and the strength to carry on? You look back at times in your life where it was simply making it through, right? You had enough oil for one day and it multiplied and it lasted a lot longer than you expected. A season of life that you could only imagine making it through 1 month, you survived a year. Sometimes these are the greatest miracles we have. Perhaps it wasn't something that you did alone, but you had someone supporting you. This is where I bring in the middle candle, because you might have said, Jake, there's 9 lights here. Your math is pretty off. The middle candle is technically not a part of the Hanukkah lights. It's known as the shamash, or the helper. It's the light used to light all of the others. And for us, there have probably been people in our lives that when we were struggling to hold on to the light, when we were struggling to keep the flame lit, there was probably someone in our life who was a shamash, who helped us, who helped us keep our flame lit. Maybe that was you for other people, right? That we can be that miracle showing up for others. But this word Hanukkah, it means dedication. And in many ways, in the context of this story, you might think of it as a rededication, a return to values. See, for these people, it was values that had been suppressed, right, through a greater power and a greater force. In other contexts, it was also values that had been compromised, right? Because in many ways, they were encouraged to let go of their beliefs and to adopt the beliefs of another larger power. And so we think about in our own lives, whatever it might mean to lose your values. And sometimes it takes a miracle, or it takes a series of miracles to find that moment of rededication. Because we all have moments in our lives where we seem to wander, we seem to lose our way, we've intentionally or not, we've lost our values, we've lost what feels like our purpose. And in many ways, it can feel like a miracle when we find our way back. It can require sometimes a transformational spiritual experience or a deeply personal one for us to experience this idea of rededicating ourselves. Growing up in evangelical Christianity, there was a fairly common practice where every so often there'd be a service, and after the service, people would be invited to come down to the front of the stage to dedicate themselves to the Christian faith. This was known as an altar call. I'm going to use a lot of Christian words right now, so if this triggers you, I'm sorry, but this was an altar call, right? There could be like a Christian dictionary, and this would be in there on A, and during the altar call, you would have people come up, but then sometimes you'd see someone that you already knew for a fact, you're like, they're already a Christian, right? Like, why is Jimmy going up to the altar? This is an altar call. And then someone would tell you, oh, no, Jimmy's like rededicating his life to God. So you could go up to the altar to dedicate yourself, or you could go up to the altar to rededicate yourself. And I have to admit, throughout my upbringing, I probably rededicated my life 8 times. But essentially the idea is that if you experienced, again, some more Christianese, if you experienced like a falling away or you backslid, and then this would be an opportunity to consciously make a moment to return to your path. But see, friends, regardless of whatever spirituality you come from or you grew up with, I think this is a deeply human experience to wander off the path and to find it again. To wander in the dark and then see the light. This doesn't even need to have anything to do with religion, right? For you to relate to the Jewish people in this story, in this return to values, return to purpose, return to one's spiritual center. And sometimes it's the hardest moments that we go through in life that inspire the rededication. That only when we are pressed do our values come to the surface. Maybe it isn't necessarily an extremely difficult moment, but sometimes we get caught up in the allure of life or the illusion of the material world, right? And we need to find our way back to our deepest spiritual truth. But friends, I think that the return, the rededication, is a part of life, right? It's a part of having values. We don't need to feel like there's anything wrong happening here. This is a part of what it means to be human. A couple of years ago when I was still living in Seattle, I invited my younger brother to come visit me, and I really wanted to take him on an epic Washington State hike because, like me, he grew up in Southern California, but he hadn't really spent much time outside of it, and so I wanted to show off the forest of Washington to him. So we get to the place that we're going to hike, and pretty quickly there was a detour that led kind of straight into the forest outside of the main trail, and I thought, okay, this is perfect. I'm going to show him how much of like Crocodile Dundee I am. We're going to go off trail, and I'm going to impress him with my knowledge and my skills, and but there are no skills that I have. So we went off trail, and within 5 minutes, it became clear that this wasn't even a trail, and we were just 2 boys walking in the woods. And then after about 20 minutes, I realized, like, okay, this is a matter of survival. Like, this isn't going well. And so we decided we need to find our way back. So then we spent another 30 minutes traversing through the woods, getting smacked in the face by branches, brushing up against things that we could only assume is poison ivy. Definitely a situation where a machete would have come in handy, but we did not have that. And so I'm feeling really guilty and ashamed having put my brother through this. And finally, with dirt on our face and cuts on our legs, we finally make our way back to the main trail. And as we do, I look and I realize we're back at the parking lot and we haven't made any progress whatsoever. We just did a full loop and we ended up right where we got off the trail. But sometimes I think this is life, right? That sometimes we lose our way, we exit the path, we take a detour, and we find ourselves when we come back right where we left off. And friends, I think that is okay. Because how many of us, if we're being really honest, how many of us have, from the very beginning, we've always known exactly who we are, exactly what we're meant to do, exactly what our path is going to look like, and we've never wavered once? How many of us? Okay. No, none of us, because life is long, right? And there are many moments where we're going to have this experience. But I think this is why we have spiritual practices. as an opportunity for a daily, a moment-to-moment act of rededication back to what matters, back to who we truly are, back to what our values are, back to what our spiritual center is. Right? So maybe it's something like contemplation. And as Richard Rohr talks about it, daily contemplation is an act of surrender, a deliberate choice to reconnect and realign with the divine flow. It's how we rededicate ourselves to the work of transformation. Or perhaps it's how Gandhi spoke about prayer. To pray is not to ask things of God, but to rededicate ourselves to the service of life, truth, and love. Or as Pema Chödrön speaks on meditation, meditation is a constant process of starting over. Every time you return to the breath, you are rededicating yourself to the path of wakefulness. And friends, I think the holidays are a significant and a poignant time for us to think about rededication for a number of reasons. First being that it's the end of the year, and if we look at time as a cycle and we look at the seasons of life, we're about to begin a new phase of that cycle. And this is an opportunity to think about what we want to take into 2025 and what we want to leave in 2024. The second is that the holidays are this beautiful opportunity of deep connection with the ones we love, with our families. And yet, how many of us know that if we're not intentional about being present and grounded during the holidays, this season can take us for a ride because it's just so busy and so chaotic. And so this is a time to center in on our values and what we want the holidays to look like. And third, this year specifically, we are all entering into a new political situation and a new environment at the beginning of next year. And however you may feel about it, it is very important for us now more than ever to rededicate ourselves to what matters, right? To what our values truly are. And when it comes to this idea of rededication and return, it is not simply found in Hanukkah, right? But there is another tradition that I think beautifully captures this idea, and it's that of Kwanzaa, which is why I have the Kinara right here. Now, I'll be honest, I didn't know a lot about Kwanzaa before doing research for this message, but I felt this pull towards honoring and celebrating and investigating Kwanzaa because of how it would meaningfully be a part of our December lights, one of those December lights. And from my perspective, I've always looked at Kwanzaa as this beautiful, ancient celebration of culture. But the twist that I came across in researching Kwanzaa is that it was started in 1966. So many of you are older than Kwanzaa. And don't let the fact that I called it ancient deter you. But Kwanzaa was established as a response to the Watts riots that took place in 1965, an example and a moment of systemic racism, police brutality, not unlike things that we have seen in recent time. But this was a pivotal and defining moment, and a moment where in the African American community, it was an opportunity to reclaim culture, to reclaim what had been lost. And so Kwanzaa is established in 1966 by Dr. Maulana Karenga. He says this, he's an activist and a professor, and he says this about creating Kwanzaa. Kwanzaa was created to introduce and reinforce the importance of African heritage and culture. In the wake of the Watts uprising, it was clear that what was needed was a cultural foundation on which we could rebuild and reaffirm our identity, purpose, and direction as a people. See, as we know in America, people of African descent have had their connection to culture taken from them. And what's interesting is not unlike the Jewish people in the story of Hanukkah, there is this opportunity to rebuild and to reaffirm identity, purpose, and direction. And so Kwanzaa is a celebration of and a rededication to African cultural values. And these values are symbolized by the kinara. There is 7 days for Kwanzaa, and there are 7 principles of Kwanzaa, which are called the Nguzo Saba. And when I share what these principles are, I just also want to invite you to think about how we might all think of these as powerful principles in our lives, in our communities. These are the 7 principles of Kwanzaa. Umoja, unity, that we are together in this journey. Kujishagulia, self-determination, realizing that when it comes to fighting for what matters, when it comes to naming ourselves and our struggle, we have to do it ourselves. It's not always going to be done for us. Ujima, collective work and responsibility, that my problems are your problems. Ujama, cooperative economics, that in our entrepreneurship, right, in our participation in the economic system, may we do it together. May our, one person's financial success bless someone else. Nia, purpose, that there is a greater purpose behind all this. Kumba, creativity, that we may leave the world a more beautiful place than we found it. And Imani, faith, that all this is done with a hope and a faith in what is possible in the world that we are creating. Now, obviously, there's so much here. We could take months just unpacking the Nguzo Saba. But whether this is an appreciation of these African cultural values, whether you can see yourself in these cultural values as just human values, period, whether you can see the story of Aldea in these values, what I love about both Kwanzaa and Hanukkah is that we see these examples of people groups who have had their culture and values stripped from them, and yet taking this opportunity to rededicate themselves as a people and to set aside a sacred time for that remembrance of that rededication. 2 years ago, on December 18th, there was a joint celebration of Kwanzaa and Hanukkah that took place at Carnegie Hall in New York, and this event was called the 15 Days of Light, for the 8 days of Hanukkah and the 7 of Kwanzaa. This is a joint event from leaders in both communities as an attempt to approach both anti-Semitism and anti-racism in an interconnected way. And Reverend Al Sharpton, who participated in this event, says this: you can't fight for anybody if you don't fight for everybody. I cannot fight for black rights if I don't fight for Jewish rights, because then it becomes a matter of self-aggrandizement rather than fighting for humanity. When we think about rededication to our values, whether it's our personal values or our cultural values, in many ways we're actually thinking about a rededication to a larger understanding of humanity as a whole. Right? That you don't need to be part of the LGBTQIA plus community to fight for their rights, to stand up for their rights, right? You can connect with the struggle of someone who's all the way on the other side of the world. They may not be your neighbors directly or geographically, and yet you can still feel that their struggle is your struggle. This is the power of rededication and really seeing our rededication in the larger context of humanity. And what's interesting about this act of rededication, to me, it makes me think in some ways of a muscle. When we tear a muscle and it grows back stronger. In many ways, when we lose our way, when we're in need of finding ourselves back or finding our way back, it's the rededication that strengthens us, right? What in your life have you seen where it was in losing your way and finding it again that it actually became stronger than ever? That the rededication was the ultimate regrowth and re-strengthening. Maybe it was a relationship that fell on hard times, right? And yet you decided to recommit yourselves to one another. And because of that moment, it was because of the difficulty that actually made you stronger. Maybe it was a moment in your career where you said, why am I even doing this? What is this all for? And then it was in the remembrance and that rededication that fueled you for continuing down that journey stronger than ever. Maybe it's your own just internal journey, your own spiritual path. Sometimes it can just be exhausting just being on that path and doing that internal work. And yet there are moments that inspire us to keep going. Maybe it's some values that are important to you, like a value of being present. And yet it can be so hard to be present in our modern world that seems to always be vying for our attention. So we need to continually rededicate ourselves to presence, or kindness, right? Sometimes it's when the world feels most unkind that when we realize we need to, more than ever, stand behind that value. Or for us here at this community, it's the value of love, period. And yet sometimes it feels harder than ever to actually live it out. So may we continually, every time we walk through these doors, rededicate ourselves to that value and that approach of love. Friends, when we think about these December lights, may we think about the resilience of that inner flame. May we think about the time that we would set aside to remember ourselves, to remember our values, to remember our spiritual center. And however you choose to celebrate the holidays this year, I just encourage you to think about these December lights. And when you do, may you be inspired to rededicate yourself to your deepest values, to your community, to love, to hope. And may you see these lights as a reminder that it is never too late to make that return journey.